Hi, I'm Gerben.
Hi, I'm Jelle. All right, so we've been discussing whether it's pronounced Radius or Radius, but that's what you're going to talk about today,
Yes.
right?
So I think we can agree on Radius. I don't know Dex, but let's say Radius for now. So yeah, I want to take you on like a journey that I did like 1 or 2 days ago when preparing this talk. It's not something that I'm an expert in. It's a new project. It's something that's in the incubator phase, but it's cool enough that I want to show you.
So how did you come across it?
I think just a message somewhere on X. I don't know, just somewhere in the stream of messages.
You're calling it X. You are so well behaved.
It is.
Well done. All right, so you've heard somewhere about Radius, and you dove into it, and you were like, damn, this is interesting. I'd like to share this.
Yes.
I'm interested.
Yeah, so Radius, you can see it here on my screen. There's a nice, there's already a nice website. Yeah, you need to have a website, right? Where is my?
Yeah.
There it is.
Your mouse.
My mouse was lost.
Yeah, mice can hide quite well.
Yes. Yeah. So Radius. So what it is running applications on Kubernetes, but what it's trying to do is to bridge the gap between a developer and a DevOps. So when we want to consume services, we want to consume Azure services, let's spin it to Azure. We define that in Bicep, but we have to be really detailed about what kind of service it is. And it's really attuned to Azure, for instance. Mm-hmm. But what Radius is trying to do is that we as developers can define, I have a application resource, and I have some services that I consume. It could be a database, it could be a backend service, but I am agnostic about how it's implemented.
Oh, that sounds really cool. So basically we're trying to exercise the environment and the components that we are using for a complete deployment.
Correct. And currently, you need to be on Kubernetes. So currently, the only runtime where this is supported on is on a Kubernetes cluster. I can imagine in the future that it will be on others.
Yeah, but it makes sense that we're starting out on Kubernetes. Yeah.
Yes. So for now, it's on Kubernetes. Let's see. I want to go to this tab here. So what are the concepts? So if you're into Kubernetes, then you might know that you have to be really detailed about the finer details of Kubernetes. You specify them in YAMLs. Maybe you do some service deployment in Biceps. And what this project is trying to do is to make that one. So to make developers, platform engineers, and operators collaborate more, and try to make it in more like an industry standard. So it is also cloud agnostic. So if you create a application with Radius, the premise is then that you can also deploy it on AWS, Azure, but also have it as a local developer.
So you say cloud agnostic, but it's actually hosting
agnostic. Yes.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, correct. So that's what Radius is.
So are we trying to make developers, are we trying to pull them more towards the operation side, or are we also pulling the operation side more to the developers?
I think it is both. So as a developer, we can think about our application. We should think more about our application as an application resource and not as, okay, I need a app service or a container or the actual resources. On the other hand, the DevOps engineer or the IT engineer, we pull them more into the application, because what we'll see is that Radius provides application resources, but on the other hand, to bind that to a real concrete instance, they have so-called recipes, and a recipe says, okay, in a Biceps file, this is the actual resource. So in the application, you say, I want to use a Redis database, and that's an abstract abstraction. So it's not an actual Redis database instance on Azure or on your container, but then a recipe binds that to the environment where you want to deploy that.
Okay, so you can who's responsible for the recipes? Is that the developer, or is that Radius, or is that someone else?
Yeah, so Radius provides some standard and default recipes, but I can imagine that that for that the infrastructure guys, or if the dev is doing that also in DevOps, and the devs would be responsible. But that's something where the connection is actually made.
Yeah, that sounds really interesting. All right, I'm assuming that you're going to show a lot. So
yeah, I'm going to walk you through a nice tutorial.
Let's go.
But first, I want to share what kind of resources are currently there in Radius. What kind of things. So on the one hand, we have the application core. So there we can have the application itself. We can define containers. So that's the actual application that gets run. We can define gateways, so that's to expose our application to the outside world. Mm-hmm. But again, it's not making a concrete choice for a front door or for an application gateway. So you're just defining, I want to expose it in a gateway.
I can imagine that the people who were working on this had a lot of trouble naming things. But maybe we'll get, besides an industry standard for using this stuff, we'll finally get an industry standard for naming stuff. Yeah. That would be cool. Okay,
so it also currently supports as first line integration with Dapper.
Right.
So Dapper is something that you can run on container apps, for instance. Data stores, so there's abstraction on some data stores, SQL and Redis, if I'm correct. Messaging. And then currently you'll specify that in a Biceps language. So in Biceps, and we will see later that for now it is, if you want to use that, for instance, in Visual Studio Code, it is a extension, but it's not the normal Biceps extension. It's a Biceps with Radius. I mean, it's that new that it's not merged upstream, so you need to install a extension. So that's where we go into the demonstration. I will just use to walk you through everything. I will just use this tutorial as a guidance. What are we building? So we are building a front-end application that is hosted in a container. It will use a data storage in the form of a MongoDB. It will use a backend, and it will use a gateway to expose it to the outside world. It could be a typical application front and backend scenario with a data store. Normally, when we would implement this, for instance, in a Kubernetes cluster, on the one hand, we need Biceps to deploy the infrastructure, to deploy the database instance, but on the other hand, we would need YAML files to deploy the front-end container. Right. We would have all kinds of different artifacts.
Yes, and artifacts that only a few of the people involved in the entire chain are going to understand.
Correct. What do we need to work with this? Like I said, you need a Kubernetes cluster. You need to install the Radius CLI. So it's a CLI. They use the joke all the time.
Yeah.
So the Radius CLI. And like I said, you need a specific Radius Biceps Visual Studio Code extension.
Visual Studio Code only?
Yes,
currently.
For now.
Yep.
It also means that you have to disable or uninstall your normal Biceps. They cannot work together because they use the same language server.
Do you lose anything?
No, because it's built on top of.
Yeah.
So you have the same functionality and then some more. Now we're going to initialize the environment. We have our Kubernetes. We have it all connected. We go into a new directory and then we initialize Rad with the CLI. And in a moment I will switch to Visual Studio Code to show you how that is done.
Yep.
And then we can show that there is actually an application created, because when you use Rad in it, it will create a default application. And on that application, then you can specify, okay, I want a container, I want a gateway, everything. So that Rad app show, we're going to do that. Let's switch to Visual Studio Code here. So I already have the CLI installed. So Rad app show. You can see that I have one application, and this is the default application. It's called Radius.
It's just the core.
This is only a application definition, so nothing is yet running. If you would look into your Kubernetes cluster, there are no deployments, no services, nothing is made. Like we're seeing here, you can also get some more detailed JSON, but there you can see more in detail the application configuration that is there. Next thing that we're going to do is look at the connections. So previously in this picture, all those lines, that are the connections of the application. Of an application, that's a container. And then we have the actual implementations. So it's not a container in a runtime function, but a application definition.
As we said, naming stuff.
Naming stuff is also... So red app connections. There we can see that currently there are no connections. So it's empty and it's displaying the application radius. Mm-hmm. You can switch applications, you can even switch environments, but that's when we get more, you go more into detail of this stuff. Now we are going to create a container. So we have you can see it's biceps. So you define a resource in this, it's demo. You have one parameter, it's application, and like it says in the description, this is automatically filled by the Radius CLI. So when we just deploy it, it gets the default Radius application name. But you can specify your own application name, right. And then it's get filled in this param, and then you can work with it. So we can deploy it. So let's do that. So red app deploy. We need to specify the bicep file. You can see the bicep file here, app.biceps.
Yeah, that's a great name for a bicep file.
Yes. So I did it wrong. Let's see what the actual command is. So it's not app, but it's deploy. You see, I'm also new with the stuff. It's exploring.
Yes, very good. And also, you've shown that the documentation is actually quite good.
It's good. It's good. So what happens here? You can see that now this container gets deployed. In a few moments, it will be there, and we'll switch back. We will see also, and we can see it already here, that it's creating a deployment for us, a service account. So all the Kubernetes stuff is happening only by just defining that I want a application container. So you skip a lot of the normal boilerplate that you have in your YAML.
Yes, but you also lose a lot of control.
We're now showing a very small portion of what you can do here. If you look into the actual specification, all the properties, you can still specify all the details, all the labeling, everything can be specified here in this property object, but this is for demo purposes a really small portion of that. So it's there. We can also see that the resource is created. If we now look into our app connections, then we'll actually see that the same that we just saw in the documentation.
Whoa.
Stuff is there, things are created. But now a cool part is, okay, we now deployed it to the container, but we also want to run it locally. So run app.bicep. And the cool thing about this is what it's also doing is creating Kubernetes proxies. So it's doing the proxying, it's doing the port forwarding, so everything is still on that cluster, but you can now use it from your...
And again, you can take control if you want to, but it will run by default.
But now it will run by default. It now says here, okay, there is a port available. Let's open it in the browser. And now we can see here, this is a nice demo container. It contains some features to show if there are any connections. So currently there are no connections. There is a to-do application, and it also says, there is no database configured yet. So I think that is then the next step.
Right.
So now we have an application. We want to add a Mongo database. So go back to our Visual Studio. We kill this application. Now let's add stuff. And you see again, it's quite tiny. So you see we specify the resource. It's a database. If we would deploy this, then we have defined a resource, but we do not yet have a connection.
Yes.
And for that, we need to add a connection. So I'm going to select this portion here.
Within the properties.
Yeah, so and that's a nice thing about Radius. It also takes care for you all those connections. So connecting up, what I read, I didn't experiment with it, but also things like identity, access management. So a lot of things happen to link those resources and applications together.
Basically everything is in the properties.
Yes. So now it's a nice thing to get it at the right level.
One lower, yeah, there you
One
go.
lower. So we defined a connection. Because of the extension, you can also see that we have some nice documentation about it. And you see, okay, now we linked this up to the database resource. And again, if we run this, we can see now that it's detecting this Bicep file, and we actually now deploy a MongoDB instance. So again, in a moment you can see, okay, there is a Mongo database now deploying.
Yeah.
That's all in progress. Switching back to our tutorial. So in a moment we'll get back to it, but you can see here it's deploying its resource. Again, it's deploying all the Kubernetes resources. And then at some point, I don't know if it's there yet. Yeah, so it's already here. You can see
cool.
There's a Radius connection. So there's a MongoDB with a very weak password. But this is a sign of no, it doesn't have to be screened. It will be removed before this get published.
Oh, of course. So interestingly, did you define these anywhere?
No.
So this is basically, it will tell you, okay, you didn't define anything, this is what you're working with.
Yes. This is actually defined in the backend recipe, so how to deploy this stuff. But you can, of course, override it.
Yeah, so the recipe provides everything if you're not overriding it, which you probably should. But
you can define that once and then have the application developer just say, okay, I want to use this database. I just want to use a database in my application. I don't need to know how it is deployed, anything. Okay, so we did that. Now if we would run app connections, we would also see that there now is a MongoDB connection. The second thing is, or the third actually, because the second was the database. Now we want a backend application, and that goes the same way. You define a resource, you define a backend resource, you put it into your Bicep file, and then you make a connection.
Right.
So let's do that. So we are copying over the Biceps. We just add another section here. This one is using Nginx. Let's get back to the tutorial and then the connection. So you see it's very easy to specify also those connections. It's just a few extra lines there. Again, up to the container. So it's, you define it in the container where you want to link that resource. We want to have it here. Now let's paste that stuff in. So it's there. So the backend connection is there. Our instance is still running. So again, it's also a pretty nice, at least I think it's a nice development cycle. You just add something in, you run it, it all gets deployed. See this as a development, so this is my development environment, a development cluster. It picks up the backend, it knows that it needs to deploy another container, and it also knows that it needs to add all those connections. Now our application is getting in some nice shape, and the last thing that we want to do is, okay, so this is all hosted locally and the routes are locally. What if I want to expose that to the internet to make it routable?
Hello world.
So what we can do there? Another resource is called a gateway resource.
Yeah. You mentioned it. So I figure this just works the same, right? That it seems to be really, really predictable.
Yes. Yeah, so another resource, same application, but we point it to our demo application.
Yeah.
Okay, so we can run it. We do not have to make any connection because it knows that it needs to connect up our application. And here in the destination, we specify the actual path that it needs to take.
Yeah. Because it can figure it out for itself.
Yes, it can also do. We did not configure it here. SSL offloading, so it has its own certificate, and then. You do not need SSL, but you can also do SSL pass-through if you want to check for certificates. So now it's deploying all that application gateway stuff, and I hope in some time it will be there.
So normally I would say, well, hey, you're introducing another standard, and there's this famous comic. I think it's XKCD, where we have 13 competing standards. Let's finalize a real standard. Now you have 14 competing standards. But this is in a field where I think standardization is currently, almost non-existent.
Correct.
So is that's what's getting me excited? But is that also how you see it? Or?
Yeah, it's one of the points for this project is to make it. At least try to make some kind of industry standard to define resources from a more developer perspective instead of mixing and matching ops and...
You're saying developer, but I see this is, if you go back to your documentation and you go to that little diagram up top, I think this is how architects tend to talk about their applications. They're staying purposefully vague.
Which one do you mean?
Yeah, there was this diagram of how you were connecting the various resources. That one. This is basically how you would introduce the topic as an architect. How the team would be like, oh, okay, so this is actually what is happening. So you're starting to talk documentation mostly.
Yeah, it's almost. I find it quite readable. To see the definition of the application now.
Yeah, so basically, I would not be surprised if one of the things that they will introduce is basically just reading this file and immediately converting that to an image.
Just such a diagram.
Yes, because that seems really easy and really plausible.
Yeah.
Really interesting.
Yeah, I agree with that. And now it's using local dev recipes, the default recipe, so it means that it gets deployed in containers in Kubernetes.
Right.
But you can switch it out, for instance, the MongoDB or this gateway, to a production recipe, and it could then be a Azure resource. So it could then be a Azure service. Yeah.
But also you could go the AWS route.
Yes, correct. So the last thing that I wanted to show, the application gateway deployed. So you can see that it now deploys to a internet routable address. Sure. So our application in Kubernetes is here, all connected up.
Really cool.
So yeah, I think it was a really cool exploration.
Yes. So are you not afraid that this will, this kind of easing developers into just building stuff that will create a security risk where developers do not tend to think about what they're doing? Especially because the use of defaults is quite heavy here. If you don't specify, it will do something.
Yeah, so it means that you need to be very wary about those defaults.
Yeah.
And make good default recipes. For instance, to introduce always managed identity. And on the other hand, if you have good defaults, then for a developer, it's very easy to just define application links and it will be all good and secure. So
basically you're saying, this is awesome. It's now the recipe development that is becoming really crucial.
Yes, you still need to do the work.
Yeah,
but it's how
Well, really interesting, and really new.
Awesome. Incubation phase. So just play with it and see if you like it and if you like some concepts.
I will, but I think everyone over there, hi, you should too. It's a really clear picture, so thanks so much. And
thank you for listening and watching.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.